Good evening and welcome to the Marian Minor Cook Athenaeum. My name is Sarah Sambar and I'm one of the fellows here. As probably everyone in this room knows, as seniors we all have to complete a capstone project, a senior thesis. And this year it's been really cool for me to get to know my friends a little better by seeing what they're interested in and what they've been researching. And I know from personal experience that this is a ridiculous amount of time and commitment. So I wanted to welcome everyone here tonight to the first time we've ever actually done this. It's our inaugural senior thesis showcase. And we've selected these seniors to come and present their topics. We've got a nice range of everything from econ to philosophy to psych to computer science. So without further ado, I would like to begin by introducing Nikki Blum.
That's me. Really attractive photo. All right, so first of all, just want to say thank you for you all for coming, and also for the ATH for letting us talk about ourselves and our projects. These are things that matter a lot to a lot of us. I think I'm kind of a bad example because I was not thinking about my thesis for a super long time in advance. Like, this wasn't something I'd been sure about for years and like came in and knew what I wanted to do. But when it kind of came time to pick topics, rather when spring semester started and I realized I had not written a thesis, it became clear to me that like something that I was passionate about and something, is this on? Is this on? No? Yeah. Is it? Yeah, okay, cool. Something that I'm passionate about is higher education. Like, I worked with it and in it and I studied through it. And it's better if you hold the microphone. Does this work? This is not on. So I'll just chill over here. All right. sorry. But basically, so I figured out that that's something that mattered a lot to me. So I kind of tried to figure out a way to work my major, which is philosophy, into the feelings I have about higher education and the feelings I have about things that are important in my world. And so I kind of settled on, this is a pretty vacuous title, but maybe it'll be the title. I haven't figured it out yet. But the ethics and purpose of higher education, because the way I track higher education kind of exists along three eras that I kind of loosely defined for myself. Like, kind of the beginning of higher education in America, and America's, the leader for higher education in the world, and we have been for some time. And so, like, these are the Harvards, the Yales, the William and Marys, these first institutions, and kind of their goals. And the goals of these institutions were largely, like, very civic, very theological. These are, like not necessarily taking the place of seminaries, but that's what the focus was. It was very communally oriented. And so that gives a kind of purpose for all these institutions and all these graduates. They're going out into the world, and they're working for, like, community, civic good. And then we move to a new era. America begins to industrialize. It's a different place afterward. We have people who are targeting very different skills when they're going through college. They're seeking to learn things that they can then go do and at some point put to work for their country. These are the kind of people that are training so that they can be effective as engineers, people who can work for the US military. And that also is a real purpose, I think, for graduates. They're going out to try and improve America, which in great terms worked. It led to us being like a global power in a really significant and like the first global superpower. And I think that there's a lot to say about college graduates' influence on that. And then when we move on, we kind of come to today, or maybe a transition. Maybe when CMC is being founded, we start being less clear about what we're supposed to be doing, like as colleges, as graduates, because we no longer have like this togetherness after the Cold War kind of breaks up. The nation doesn't need us, right? Like, I don't have a clear thing that I can do for America that will make America better, that can like bring people together or in any way. We kind of lose that. And I think since like the 1980s and 90s, something that colleges started to do is focus on college rankings as a kind of substitute for what I think is really important, like a goal, like a purpose. The reason that these colleges exist are all channeled in mission statements, but those mission statements kind of are a little bit left to the wayside when you start thinking about things like yield rate or acceptance rate or how much your alumni are donating to your college, which matter. They really do matter, because that's how the US News and World Report or Forbes or any of the major ranking systems, they determine based on criteria these components that are metrics, because they have to have metrics. That's how you build a ranking. But I think these rankings really distort what institutions of higher education are supposed to be doing, which is educating people. And so kind of what my thesis does is lays out two things that I think colleges aren't necessarily doing and really need to think about doing, or reevaluate their strategy in doing. One, which is cultivating learning on their campuses. There's no way to know how much people learn through college. You can take standardized tests on the way in, but there's no similar standardized tests on the way out. There's no way to know what it does to us to be in this place for 4 years. Like, I know personally, coming to Claremont, like, I am a much better in every way person than I was 4 years ago. But the US News doesn't really capture that, and nor do they really even care about that. So I think one thing that colleges need to do is devise a pre and post testing system so that they can see what they're actually doing to their graduates. This doesn't mean like you need to know facts about history, or like, I think across disciplines, there are critical thinking components that we all can agree graduates should have. And that's what elite institutions of higher education like CMC purport to give, right? We say, we're gonna make you better. I think this gives you a way to say, here's how we made you better. So that's one of my ideas. And my other idea, it's kind of a reaffirmation of a lot of college mission statements. Almost every college has something about, maybe it's responsible leadership if you're CMC, if you're Harvey Mudd, it's kind of like the way you practice science within the global spectrum and how you work with communities. Across the board, almost every, like Harvard's is for civic good or something directly to those effects. But I think the idea is that we want to reaffirm that. We want people to start thinking about equality instead of going out and being as effective as they can in the most brute ways they can. I don't know that my experience at CMC has told me not to go personally succeed as much as I can. And I'm not sure that it needs to, but what it, I think, needs to be paired with is a sense of wanting to do right and good by my peers, by people who didn't get to attend Claremont McKenna College or don't attend a college at all, but to kind of continue to be mindful of those people. I think it's really easy to become bubbled in the kind of upper echelon that elite college can put you in, and then kind of forget. And so I think reaffirming those original college mission statements, it's not a lot for college to look at their own, why they were founded. And I think that that's really important. Along the lines of my process, and I'm sorry for diving into content first, but that's kind of, oh, now it's on. Now it's on, okay. Well, too late. So I didn't really have a strong sense, and then I had a lot of help from Jeff, who graciously and perfectly fits as kind of the intersection of philosophy and higher education. There's nobody who knows, I mean, his email is jeff@CMC. Like, he knows what he's talking about. So I was really lucky to have like a really wonderful advisor who just got served a 50-page draft today that I'm sure he'll turn over tonight, you know, like easily. But I think that matters a lot. In terms of advice, like, it's hard for me to say like what I think the hardest parts or the easiest parts of the thesis process are. I just think that the most important thing is to do something that like means something to you. Like, isn't just like the research paper like the easy prompt or something, the thing you know you can churn out. Like, this is too much time to want to spend on anything that isn't like your personal capstone. Like something that you're gonna look at and be like, oh, I'm excited to explain this to somebody in an airport or your kids or something, I don't know. And so I just think that that's the most important thing. And I'm really lucky to have found something that I wanna continue writing on. Like, this is something that I think is gonna matter to me for a long time. And and maybe that's because I think it's gonna matter to a lot of other people and for a long time. Anyway, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And I think Nicole is up next.
Back one to start. All right. So, everyone has their own way of going about the whole thesis process. And for me, I'm the kind of person who's going to start any assignment way, way, way before I even need to think about it. So for me, thesis started the last couple weeks of junior semester. I asked Professor Camp to be my reader, and then went off to start my internship at Amnesty International, where I was working with Ethiopian and Sudanese refugees, documenting a lot of the human rights abuses that were going on in that region. And at the time, I didn't think that Ethiopia was going to factor in my thesis, but as it turns out, a lot of the experiences that I had over the summer, and lucky for me, I was writing about everything that I was seeing and thinking every single day just for my own use. It turned into an entire chapter. So now I have 25 pages on that, and I think just to keep in the back of your mind, if you are a junior or a sophomore and you're going to be looking to do thesis later on, really pick an internship and classes that you're passionate about, because you really realize how much they all interconnect when the time comes to write your thesis, and you realize that you've actually done a lot of the work already. You just need to find a way to synthesize it. So with that said, I'd like to also preface my presentation by saying that when I was young, my family, my stepmother specifically, she was a human rights activist that worked in Latin America. And so growing up, starting at 8 years old, we would go to the different locations in the world where she was working. And I remember one of the first places that I went was Haiti. We landed in Port-au-Prince, and the very few things that I do remember was my dad just shoving me into the taxi. The windows didn't work, so of course they were open, and people were shoving their hands in, and we were pushing ourselves through the unpaved streets of Port-au-Prince with smoke and dust just pouring into the windows. There was a man who was rolling a dead pig in a wheelbarrow. I'm still not sure why. And there was also just things on fire and trash cans everywhere. And as an 8-year-old, you're looking at this and you're wondering, where in the world did this come from and what created these situations? Because here I am from a nice New England town in Massachusetts, never having seen anything like this before in my life. So you wonder, how do you connect the dots? And how is it that some people live in a situation like that, while I can go home to my nice New England house and have a grocery store nearby and hot coffee and a really nice warm bed to sleep in at night? So with those two things, we look at what's been in the news all this time with climate change and natural disasters, hurricanes, earthquakes, you name it. And it seems to be the product of nature going out of control and the way that global warming is affecting our world, and tidal patterns and heat waves, that we really can't do much about the natural disasters that are going to strike the most vulnerable regions in the world. If I had my thesis with me right now, I could cite the exact data, but it's actually the case. There have been studies, natural disasters such as earthquakes happen 2/3 of the time more in wealthy regions of the world. And the impoverished regions actually experience fewer natural disasters than the wealthy regions. But it's oftentimes the case that we're going to see the poorest regions show up in the newspaper. You have the hurricane just last semester, which occurred in Haiti and the Dominican Republic, which was flashing in at least my cell phone every 10 seconds with the death count just going up and up and up. And this is something that we need to understand is created by a complex system of social and political and economic roots. There was a class I was taking spring semester junior year where we came across this very specific graph when I was writing one of my papers. And it was looking at how natural disasters are created. And this was something I had never really seen before or thought of, because they are natural disasters. So we like to think that they're a product of the environment and climate change. But really, when you look at it deep down, the situation like I described in Haiti is the result of histories that were centuries in the making. You have colonialism, where Africans were imported in hundreds of thousands and brought into slave plantations for sugar and coffee production. And it was cheaper to simply kill the slaves and work them to death and import new African slaves than it was to actually maintain adequate conditions in the slave quarters. And you wonder what kind of system created that, and then after independence would enable any sort of stable government when you have, especially in Haiti again, the case where they were required to pay a 95 million franc debt off to France after they won their independence, because the plantation owners lost their slaves and their land in the War of Independence that occurred on Haitian soil. And the rest of the Western world completely ostracized them and cut off diplomatic ties until Haiti paid off their debt 90 years later. These are the kinds of things that create the unsafe conditions and dynamic pressures that underlie the entire environment, which, when a natural disaster, which I call hazards in my thesis, strikes, for example, in Haiti it would be a hurricane, it's a trigger. It's not a disaster in and of itself, but it's all the underlying pressures that are created by the economic systems, the political systems, and the social biases inherent to that community, which then create the disaster you see. So going back to this past January, myself and a number of other CMC students went to Nepal. And at this point, my thesis was Haiti, Ethiopia, and if you're curious about Ethiopia, you can come ask me later. I don't have time to talk about it now. And I was going to write about China, because China's a really interesting case study of how they've been able to mitigate natural disasters through a very authoritarian and structured government. But then I went to Nepal, and Nepal really inspired me. If any of you don't know about the history of Nepal, since 2008 alone, they've had another 10 different constitutions, and they have been turning over government after government since they won independence from Britain back in the late 1800s. And there's a high incentive, in Nepal especially, they're one of the most at-risk regions in the world for earthquakes. But yet you have very few mitigation efforts. You don't have a lot of investment in infrastructure or stability or warning mechanisms to really create the kind of safety net that the people would need. So everyone is unprepared, and when an earthquake hits, you get this. Meanwhile, the government is completely in shambles, and there's a high incentive, this is something called the racket effect, for governments to actually take a step back and not invest in the infrastructure that would create preventative measures, because they know that the international community, based on prior aid donations, will come in and fill the void that they need. And if there's the ability to, they can then pocket that money, supplement GDP, but also stuff a little in their own pockets for themselves. So it creates this system of just basically an empty vacuum where money is falling into it. Meanwhile, Kathmandu is left like that. And this is the village that we went to visit up on the Tibet border, which if you look on the right-hand side there, that is an irrigation pipe which did not exist until about a week before we got there, which services 2 different villages in the community. That's 1,500 people get water from those 2 pipes. And this is 2017. The earthquake happened in 2015. So the United Nations hasn't been there. The Nepali government hasn't been there. These people are still left like this, and you wonder why. But if you do the research and you look down, these are ethnic groups that have absolutely no value to the government. The only reason that the Nepali government has even started building a road to this region is because it's the one pass that you have to China. And living with that community and seeing how resilient they were, but also realizing that the only print of the UN there were some tarps that said UN Refugee Agency, and they were hanging alongside cowsheds, and that's where a majority of families were then living until they had the money to rebuild their homes. So it's this system which you might experience when you do different abroad trips and you go to certain regions which are really disadvantaged and excluded from society, or whatever it might be. You can read about it in different books. But again, you have to look at sort of the underlying causes and really understand the situation that you're seeing as the result of a complex system at play. Nothing is one exclusive event. So the natural disaster itself is not the product of climate change. It's something which we can actually control and mitigate. And thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of lives can be saved if we understand that this is the result of a power system which is centuries in the making, and it's excluding certain people, disenfranchising the masses. And we really need to create a more democratic and participatory system so that those with the most at stake have a chance at reinventing the situations that they face in everyday life. So that's what I'm looking at for my thesis.
Hi. First, I just want to say thank you so much to Priya for organizing this. It's really an honor. My name is Jessica, and I'm a student of Environment, Economics, and Politics. My advisor is Professor Bill Asher, and he's helped me through this year-long thesis. And in EEP, you can choose to do your thesis on any one of the 3 areas, but it has to have an environmental focus. And I chose to focus on waste management policy. Now, usually when I say that to people, they do a little, like, waste. Yeah, and it ends there. But kind of got you guys trapped here tonight. So now I get to say, yeah, this stuff is really important. And it's important because we really don't see it here. And that's purely because our waste management system is so efficient. And I realized this when I went abroad. This is a picture from Tanzania, but I didn't take it. And in places like this, the government can't fund a waste management system through taxpayers just like they do here. And as a result, as people are increasingly able to buy products, they don't have a way to dispose of them. And it's really a big problem because it can pile up and cause disease. It can block flooding and cause flooding. And so it has environmental, economic, and social harm. And so I really started to think about what is a way that we can help build this infrastructure so that as countries develop, we won't be placing such a burden on the government. And as I left, it made me think, who should be taking on this burden? And what I really came to was that, you have the producers of these products who are on one side of the spectrum. They make and then they sell, and then they don't have any responsibility for the end of life of the product. It seems like a very one-way cycle. It's not quite fair. And a lot of people were thinking similarly. There's actually a policy called extended producer responsibility that it's a whole waste management approach. And so that's what I'm looking at in my thesis. Extended producer responsibility, and I'll call it EPR, is defined as an environmental policy approach in which a producer's responsibility for a product is extended to the post-consumer stage of that product's life cycle. And so I'm looking at how would this policy work in practice. Now, I was really interested in the application for developing countries, but I don't know much about the policy structure in developing countries. So to really focus on how the policy works, I've looked at the global trends, the national trends, and then done a specific case study of California. And believe it or not, we actually have quite a few policies in California for extended producer responsibility. And they're mostly things that we can't normally send to the landfill. And so when I was looking at these policies, I looked at our government agencies' policy structure, how they make the policies, how the policies have been working, and then also talked with nonprofits that have lobbied on both sides for the bills, and then government best practice guides. And in doing this, I found that there's really a range of the ways that you can shift the responsibility. On one hand, you can shift it through more of a broad product stewardship approach, which is what California does for things like mattresses, carpet, and paint. And in doing this, when they sell the product, you pay a specific fee, which just covers the cost of disposal. On the other hand, they can do the extended producer responsibility where the producer takes on the full cost. And the way they usually do this is the government will set a performance standard and say, you need to take back this % of what we estimate has come to its end of the product life. And they do things like this for agricultural pesticide containers, recalled products, and mercury thermostats. The way that you would decide what type of product or what type of policy and the way that the responsibility is shifted depends on the type of the product and its value and its value at the end of life, and then the potential to redesign it. And then this is kind of where you start to get into the weeds of the policy and how it's worked. So far, extended producer responsibility has worked somewhat. And the main reason for that is that the way that producers respond to this policy depends on the amount of competition to fulfill the waste management policy. If there are a lot of different groups that can potentially serve to take on this obligation, then the government can, choose between them and make sure that they're effective. But if there's only one, then they can kind of say, well, you don't really have any other options except me, and they don't meet those extended producer responsibility goals. And then the second half is that the government really has to enforce these goals that they set out. And so far, that has been mediocre in both cases. So I came away saying that, extended producer responsibility represents a really unique opportunity, because by making the producer take on this responsibility, they have a reason to redesign their product in a way that it could be more environmentally friendly. But they have to do this policy in such a way that there's competition for the different groups that can possibly fulfill the obligations, and the government has to hold to its standards and enforce what it's saying. And I believe that these can translate over to the producers in developing countries, but it's going to be important to recognize the potential for corruption there too if there's government and producer relationships. So just a couple of things that I learned from this process. First, when you're thinking about your potential thesis topic, if you haven't already, I would definitely encourage you to think about the potential for fellowship applications and grad schools. This is really your chance to say, like, I'm an expert in this and I can potentially lead a project for it in the future, and you don't really get that opportunity to build a skill set in a different way. So that's really something important to consider. Second, I was a little bit nervous about how to approach my reader. Do I come with a topic? Do I ask them, like, what do you recommend? And a lot of potential readers are here. They can speak to this differently, but I think you can come with either approach. I would just recommend trying to set your reader before the semester begins. You don't have to add it to the ad deadline, but those 2 weeks when you don't have many other obligations, they're valuable writing time, especially if you change your focus a little bit. And then third, I chose to do a year-long thesis, and people have different opinions on this. Some people are terrified about it. It gets long and it's a lot of time. For me, the chance to have it be the only thing that I thought about, the only thing that I had to think about over like winter break and spring break, that was really nice. I don't think I would have been able to dive in as deeply if I hadn't had that. And last, obviously, any policy depends really on the general public. So make sure that you dispose of your waste carefully, all types. Thanks so much.
Hi, everyone. Again, I'd like to echo what's been said before about thanking Priya and, in general, Dave Edwards, the general school community for giving us the opportunity to sort of present these things that we've been so devoted to, whether it's been for a year or just a semester. So to begin, I'm just going to generally talk about my thesis. I'm a philosophy and public affairs major. My reader is Professor Alex Racy. So the way that generally philosophy theses work, you sort of you choose a topic, you examine the existing research that's already out there, and then you try to develop your own argument, your own take on the situation, all the while, as if you've taken philosophy courses, you have to challenge, you have to come up with counterexamples, you have to consider what the other side may say. So I'm just gonna get into sort of the existing arguments. So I guess, so basically, I'm studying justice and migration and using Syrian refugees as a case study. I'm specifically trying to focus on cases in which war refugees who are looking for places to go, whether or not they should be allowed into certain countries, under which circumstances, things like that. So my thesis is an examination, first of 3 prominent arguments to sort of frame the debate about war refugees, and then there are some counter arguments that I came across, and then of course a presentation of my own argument while also trying to formulate what potential responses would be to that. So I'm just gonna super briefly touch on each argument that I'm discussing specifically. So the first comes from Jennifer Kling. She basically is trying to conceive of this idea of permissible harm, because obviously in war, there's gonna be some harm that's gonna occur. There's gonna be someone who's gonna be disadvantaged, and there's always gonna be an intention behind when that happens. So she goes a lot into traditional Western war theory. She talks about whom is responsible for the harm when refugees are displaced, in which circumstances, and so she specifically targets this idea of moral repair. So ultimately she concludes that there is a distinction between blame and justice, and that within our conception of the law, that's not always a distinction that's very clear. But she ultimately advocates specifically that refugee camps should not be a permanent situation for people who are displaced. Next is Jovana Davidovic. She talks about this concept of responsibility. So she definitely dives in deeper about specifically refugees that are resulting from the Iraq War, from ISIL, from the conflict in Syria. So she really is trying to sort of flesh out the responsibility that is necessary for these specific people coming from these situations. And so she basically comes to the conclusion that if we epistemically have a solid set of reasons to think that there is a limited amount of danger to ourselves, to our community, and that the result is going to be very positive in terms of accepting some of these cases, then we should definitely let those refugees in and provide them a space and resources to live. The last philosopher who's sort of pro is Koukouthis. He basically says that the root of the problem is that there is never just one source of injustice or suffering. This is sort of something that Nicole was referencing in her thesis as well, is that it's always going to be a nuanced situation. There's always going to be multiple actors, multiple factors, and it comes down to the interaction of all of those things, and that's why it's so difficult to sort of place, not blame, but sort of from which source are we trying to find this idea of justice. So while considering moral repair, this is why it's so difficult to do so. And then getting into the counter arguments, there's one from David Miller. He advocates for greater security, but he doesn't think that war refugees should ever be treated as long-term immigrants in the places where they are seeking refuge. He advocates for safety zones that are closer to the home country, and he upholds this idea of culture homogeneity, which has its implications, but it is a very, very valid argument. And then there is a journal that's called Mere Orthodoxy, which offers very interesting interpretations. It's some scholars who are from the Christian faith, and they advocate for certain positions. Specifically, I'm looking at this argument from Stephen Wolfe, who argues against open immigration on a basis similar to David Miller. And he believes that immigration brings about a clash of culture, cultural confusion, and insecurity. So of course, that's a valid argument. It does have its places where you can disagree. So when it comes to my own argument, I do have sympathies towards the first 3 authors. Specifically, I don't believe that there should be permanent refugee camps, and that there are reasons to think that if the danger and the cost of the country is low, that that country should provide refuge. I don't really prioritize cultural homogeneity in such a high position, because I do think that when you're in an immediate dangerous situation, that getting you out of that situation should be paramount, specifically if the country can accept you and provide you resources. But I do believe that local and domestic security do matter when you're considering some of these cases. So that brings me to my case study. So when thinking about sort of the motivations that inspired me to select this topic, in the fall, of course, there were so many protests going on, specifically in LA. So this is a photo from the Women's March in downtown LA. And then this is a photo from the protests at LAX, specifically related to the executive order barring certain people from certain countries from entering into the country. So obviously the energy at these protests were absolutely incredible, and seeing such a range of people in terms of every single type of diversity you could imagine, race, gender, age. There's really funny, I think that's David Bowie. I'm not sure like what he has to do with the protest specifically, but there was just so much going on. There's such a great energy at these places, but it also is important to point out that beyond the emotional side of things, this is the type of research that needs to be done, because when I'm delving into these different authors, there's so much nuance. Nothing is really just like binary argument. There's so much within each argument that's so valid and that should be acknowledged, and that is bringing something to the table that is not necessarily conveyed when you're thinking about the emotional side of things. So when I'm thinking about like how I came to conceive of this thesis, I think about like the aerial view, and I think that back when I was at these protests and becoming so inspired, that was sort of the aerial view. I was thinking, you know, oh my gosh, this is something I'm so interested in. But again, that's such a I was so stepped back from the actual research that needed to be done. And I didn't really know how deep the topic went at the time. And so when I'm thinking about sort of what I want to show and what I hope to show in this, it's like there's such a breadth and depth of the research and analysis that needs to be done and that already exists. So it's been really difficult to formulate my own argument and my own topic and sort of really grapple with the nuance, like I said, that exists. But I hope to show how necessary the work is by doing the labor myself. So I would say in the formulation of my own arguments, I was certainly in the weeds. So it's so different from being in the aerial view, from being so stepped back and saying, oh my gosh, this is so interesting, to being actually in the weeds and feeling like, you know, I feel like sometimes I'm just like in a field and like there's no one there. Like maybe Professor Racy's like shining a flashlight and being like, go this way. But like ultimately I'm like such in the weeds. And it requires that occasional zooming out process of just like stepping back occasionally and saying, okay, where exactly are you going? How are you conceiving of this argument? I include this message from my really great friend of 4 years. She has been like my confidant on everything throughout the entire thesis process, but this is so indicative of like when you have a huge deadline coming up, it's like, yes, I actually drank probably 8 espresso shots and we're in this together, and like we have to zoom out and understand that like the deadline will be reached. So this is my advice to the underclassmen, is sort of, you know, you're in the weeds, but be in the weeds with someone else, you know? Be in the weeds with a buddy. So that gets into my advice. So I really think the buddy system works. Like I said, Rachel is like my go-to girl when it's like, you know, it could be 9 p.m. on a Friday. It's like, let's go to Papa. I'll bring the coffee. So you kind of have to acknowledge that like the buddy system does work, and there is something very powerful about working towards, you know, a very succinct and individual goal while alongside someone. So like the clacking of her keys is like what drives me forward as well. Some practical advice just for the underclassmen in the room: Google Docs. Always back up your work. All my work is in the cloud. I've heard horror stories about hard drives failing. Just practically make sure there's no disasters. You don't want to see any amount of work go down the drain, because you are putting forth such like a strong effort in your thesis. And then just about being in the weeds. I think being in the weeds is a good thing too. Like there's really nothing wrong with being in the weeds. Like if you think about every time you've grown in your life, like every time you work out and your muscles are so sore after, next time it's so much easier to like go back and like revisit those muscles. So being in the fray is a good thing. That's not something to be threatened about or scared of. This is a photo I took this morning. It's a poster from an artist at Pitzer, and I hung it on my wall because every day when I wake up, I want to be encouraged and be reminded of exactly why I'm pursuing this topic. And as hard as it is when you're waking up and you're like, oh no, I have a chapter due, like, words to express to Rachel, but like really it's like that constant encouragement, and also sort of echoing what Jessica was saying about choosing a topic that actually matters to you and is actually meaningful to you. And then the last thing I would say in terms of advice is about being really proactive in the way you approach your thesis. I mean, I compare proactivity to eating your vegetables. Your parents can tell you, eat your vegetables. Your doctor will say, eat those vegetables, but ultimately, like, you have to kind of choose to, like, eat the salad occasionally, and you kind of have to, like, you know, it's not that fun to eat broccoli all of the time, but really I could say forever and over, like, eat your vegetables, work ahead, find your reader, but ultimately you have to do that for yourself and really make the decision to do so. So I'd say, of course, be proactive, but everyone will tell that to you. It really is up to you to just do it. So thank you so much for listening.
Hi, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Julia Blanco. I'm an economics and psychology major, and I chose to do my senior thesis in psychology, specifically at the Claremont Autism Center, and I'm a squad of graduate students from CGU from the Autism Center over here. And so I'm really excited to be here and talk to you guys about it, because I've been really excited about it. If you get me talking about it, sometimes I don't shut up, especially it's happened to me in a couple of interviews, so that's probably not a good thing, but I get really excited about it. So I chose to do it at the Autism Center because I've worked there for the past 3 years now. I started this summer after my freshman year, and it's something that I've really loved. And I plan on going into tech after I graduate. So I knew I wanted to do something that involved the intersection of tech and working at the Autism Center. So I have like the longest title of all time up here, but basically I'm using text messaging to increase conversational language in children with autism. And in case you don't know, autism is a deficit in social communication and restricted and repetitive behaviors. So I'm using children who are on the spectrum. So for some of them, it's really hard for them to initiate conversations. For others, they tend to repeat the same things over and over, so they wouldn't just have a typical conversation. So I'm using 8 children between the ages of 6 and 12, and it's been a really exciting experience for me. So I'll show you, I'll kind of explain my model up here. I have an interesting picture because it's kind of hard to imagine in your mind. And so basically, I have 2 children who are receiving text messages, and they're in a play scenario. And I have 2 therapists behind them, and they're texting appropriate language. So it might be something like, you know, let's play with blocks. Like, I want to build a tower. Give me blue block. So they're given appropriate language that's being modified as they're going, as they're playing and as they're communicating. So if the topic switches to, you know, some of them talk about school. So if they're talking about their favorite class at school, then it's not just a script where it's, you know, already played out. It's now we can help, you know, help script out what would be appropriate to talk about with school, as opposed to one of the children going off on a rant or not responding at all. So this is some of my results. This is one child in particular. So it's obviously pretty small, but as you can see in the beginning, he was at between like about 30 to 50% appropriate behavior. So this meant that less than half the time in a conversation he would say appropriate things, and the other percent of the time either he wouldn't respond to his peer or he would say something that was off topic, inappropriate. And so as you can see, during baseline it was pretty standard, under 50%, and during treatment, so during the text messaging, it has improved between 70 and 80%. And then assessing it, it pretty much stayed there. And then 2 weeks after I finished with my study was a follow-up to see if the behavior was maintained, and it was. So it's been really cool to see this. And the second graph kind of shows something similar with just the percentage of appropriate versus inappropriate, and the times that he also didn't respond. So at the beginning during baseline, it was about a third of each. So a third of the time he was saying something that was relevant, a third it was entirely off topic, or he was just making sounds, and then a third time he wouldn't respond to his peer. And so as you can see, it improved pretty significantly, which is really cool to see those types of results. So I guess I'm obviously really excited about my findings because this has been pretty standard for all the kids that I've worked with. They've all shown improvements, which is awesome. And so I think I've just been really lucky to be able to work with great people, great grad students. My reader and advisor is Professor Marjorie Charlotte, who can't be here today. And then there's also wonderful students who work in the Autism Center, like Pat Dixon's back there and Claire Klein, and they're all helping me. So that's been one of the best things. And just kind of to reiterate one of the points that Taylor said is the buddy system. It's great. So I'm lucky that I obviously get to work in the center with great people. But it's also been really helpful that I'm able to bounce ideas off people. So there are students who've, been in my study and they're able to be, therapists and participate. But also as I'm going through it, I'm really able to talk to them about it, see, get their fresh ideas and see, different things that I wouldn't necessarily think to do. So that's been really cool. And as an underclassman, I think you wouldn't normally think to do this, but if you're talking to a senior about their thesis, really delve into what they're doing because they want to talk about it. Most of us are really excited about what we're doing, or at least hopefully. And so if you have any ideas, I think people genuinely like to hear them. So yeah, that's what I have to say. And then I guess challenges for me was just going in each day and working with children. So it can be really ambiguous. I have no idea what's gonna happen. We had one day where a child had a massive bloody nose in the middle of a session, so I had to cut out pretty much a whole day of data, and that's pretty gross. But I think the same can be true with anybody's study. You don't really know what direction it's going to go in, and I had no idea that my results would turn out so well, and so at times I was scared that nothing was going to happen, and that I was just wasting the kids' time. So I think it's really just being confident and being excited about what you're doing and knowing that if you have no idea what you're doing, it'll eventually work out. So that's what I have to say.
Hi, everyone. Okay, so, oops. Whoa. My thesis, okay, I'm Julian, and I'm a computer science major at MUD, although a CMC student, so I'm off-campus major at MUD. And CMC still requires you to do a thesis even if your major doesn't. So as a math geek, and I came into CMC as a math major, I was like, okay, maybe I'll try to do a math thesis. So I had discrete math with Professor Sam Nelson right there. And I was like, oh, Prof. Nelson works on some pretty interesting stuff, a very niche side of mathematics called knot theory. So I emailed him over the summer, and I was like, hey, can I do a paper with you? And he was like, yeah, sure, and he emailed me a bunch of stuff and past papers he's worked on with students. So I've read at this, virtual knots and links with finite mu by k. We're good? All right. All right, so I'll do an intro on knot theory, and then sort of just give a rundown at the end on what I really did. And then I'll also talk about my capstone AKA clinic at Harvey Mudd, which is required for computer science majors. So knots. We're all familiar with knots. Right? So, we tie our shoes, we tie our ties, some people sail, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, et cetera, et cetera. So knot theory, the name obviously is inspired by that area, but it's a little different than your traditional knot, right? Because when you think about knots, you're tying something together, you can untie it, et cetera, et cetera. So in math, you can't explicitly untie knots, okay? So knots in knot theory are defined as simple closed curves. Okay, so what's a simple closed curve? I'm not going to talk about the simple part, but the closed curve. So meaning that there's no loose strands, basically. So look at the first one right here, it's a circle. There's no loose strands. You good? All right. Now the second one, there's no loose strands. And you see here, there are 3 parts where it kind of intersects or goes under or over itself. If it's solid, that means it goes over. So you see the top left right there. I think there's a pointer. I don't know. That strand crossed over that one. And these are called crossings, okay? There's 3 crossings there. There's 4 crossings there, 5, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So these are knots. And the core part about knot theory is figuring out which knots are the same as the other ones and which knots are not the same as the other ones. Yes, it's keeps you up at night, right? So cool things you can do with knots are some moves. These are actually called Reitermeister moves. They're Reitermeister came up with them. He's a German guy. He's dead now, but lasting impact on the area of mathematics. So just a brief rundown, okay? So there's 3 moves. So the first move, it's kind of simple. Oh, let me preface this. So basically what you do is you zoom in on a part of a knot. So maybe you're looking at this, right? It's kind of overwhelming. So you zoom in on this part, or you zoom in on this part, et cetera, et cetera. So you zoom in on that part, and the idea is that you can do these moves, and if you do them, this knot, like the essence of the knot is still the same, okay? So if it's kind of wrapped around itself, you unwrap it, it's still the same knot, like in the essence kind of way. Like when you look at it, you're like, oh yeah, that's different, like geometrically, but no, we don't care about that, we just care about the essence, okay? Here it's the same idea. If the string is entirely over another string, I'm gonna use string, I guess. So you pull it apart, that's still the same knot, right? Or you pull it together, that's still the same knot. And the same idea here, this one is just, this strand is entirely over the other 2. If you pull it around or back, it's the same one. We good? Cool. So this is like an elementary idea. So here you have the circle. This is actually called an unknot, right, Professor? Yes. Okay. So let's say we localize here, right? We twist it on itself. The first move, we get this kind of infinity sign, sideways 8. Still the same knot. You twist it again, it's still the same knot. Or you twist it back, etc. Okay? So that's a simple idea. But what if I give you these 2? And I say, are these the same? So one way you could do it is painstakingly try every move, which is, I think, a lot of moves. Like, oh, let's do 3, 2, 1 on every single part of it and see if we can end up with that. No, that's, I don't think there's any computational power in the world for you to like use to get that, or to prove that you can't get that, right? Because that's the whole point. So knot theory has developed this thing called knot invariance. So essentially, qualities of the essence of the knot that do not change, even if they look different, okay? Even if at some point you can use these moves to connect them with each other, okay? Some are easy, you just do one move, boom, it's the other one. But some require 1,000 moves, okay? But easier to calculate these essences. So what a medial biquet, or actually a fundamental medial biquet is basically one of these kind of qualities of a knot. And Professor Nelson and I came up with an algorithm which we coded up, and basically it can compute each of these qualities related to these crossings, and then put them into this nice little matrix. So if you did linear algebra, you'd be really familiar with this. And then basically we can expand or reduce this matrix to the point where maybe they look really different, but we get the same matrix, then we can say, yes, these are the 2 exactly same knots, even though they look different, okay? Now, these are just normal knots, right? So mine was a virtual knot, right? So now you're saying, what is a virtual knot, okay? Because these are already kind of virtual already. So now, virtual knots. Okay, this is actually a link, all right? So link is 2 separate strands which are linked together. Makes sense? And now, so that was a crossing I just showed you. Now what is this? So that actually means a virtual crossing, okay? And that virtual crossings are what makes links and knots virtual. So essentially when we look at knot theory, we look at it on a 2D plane, right? So you go around. Now, what if we change the space of the knot? So now imagine one of the strands, and you expand the space of the strand to be a 1 genus space, all right? Which basically is a donut, right? And then they cross each other inside the donut, and then that one right here, it comes kind of outside the donut, around the donut, and then comes back in again. So essentially at that crossing, they don't actually intersect. You can think about it that way. But then when we project onto a 2D plane, they intersect again. But they don't actually intersect. Does that make sense? So essentially, one side intersects, but the other side kind of, oh, it's coming up, and it goes on a bridge and goes around it. But when you're looking at it, it kind of intersects, but it kind of doesn't. Yeah. Professor Nelson has tenure because of this stuff. All right. All right. So essentially, our algorithm can work on this kind of stuff too. And it's really cool. So I noticed everyone was talking about real-life ramifications of this stuff. So I tried to look this up, and we kind of talked about this briefly. So on Math Exchange, this professor was saying, what do I answer when people ask me what do I need knot theory for? One of the answers was, if you can convince students that smooth manifolds in 3 or 4D is the most interesting and beautiful thing in the universe, they can tell them that knot theory is the essence and like really fundamental part of constructing those models and how you can look at those things. Convinced? Okay, so actually the foundation of knot theory, sort of like where it all began, was Lord Kelvin, aka Kelvin, like the degrees, right? He had a really good friend, Tate, who they wrote this thing called the Treatise on Natural Philosophy, so like a really fundamental like physics and chemistry book in the 1800s. And Tate, this guy, started kind of looking at, they were all friends with Thomson, all those people, and they were like, you know what? We think atoms and molecules and stuff, because they couldn't see them back then, right? Like, they're just knots in the ether, okay? So Tate was like, yeah, this is cool. So he started like drawing a lot of knots and stuff, and then kind of gave up his whole physicist thing. So that's where knot theory began. But real, like, I guess what is used right now, it's unwinding DNAs, molecules as well. I looked up, there's a paper from an MIT mathematician who wrote about like basically quantum finance, and basically using the ideas of knot invariance. So basically you have two different knots, you can tell if they're the same or not. You can make a crypto currency with that. So Peter Shor, he's a professor at MIT, the paper came out like 6 years ago. It's pretty interesting. So yeah, that's knot theory. Any questions? Yeah. And then, so I'm gonna talk about CS now. So for computer science at Harvey Mudd, they require you to do clinic. So what clinic is, basically, you have teams of 4 to 5, and you work on a problem, whether it's a feature or an experiment that a company that approaches Harvey Mudd wants to do. So the idea is to give students real-world project working experience. And I believe now Keck has a program like that too, inspired by Clinic. So they work with biotech companies on drugs and all that kind of stuff. But for us, our team, for example, is working with Google, and we're doing tab serialization in Chrome, which everyone understands. So Chrome, everyone uses Chrome, right? So the idea here is when you have too many tabs, occasionally happens to me, I'm sure it happens to some people at least. If you open 30 YouTube tabs and you load them all, this will happen to you. So you lose all those tabs because basically Chrome runs out of memory, right? Well, when you're buying a new computer, they're like, oh, 8 gigs of RAM, 16 gigs of RAM. Basically, when Chrome starts up, the operating system, your Mac or your Windows, will say, hey, Chrome, you get 1 gig or 2 gigs or something like that. And then Chrome's like, okay, cool, I have 2 gigs of RAM. Now, every time you open a new tab, you need more memory. So you have 2 gigs, you open one, it's like, okay, that's gonna use a tenth of that, edges up, right? So when you use up that memory, Chrome has to decide, okay, we need to kill this memory consuming tab so that you don't lose other stuff. Or at some points, Chrome might say, screw it, I can't do this, so it just kills everything. Now, if you're watching YouTube, that's not such a big deal, right? Because you can just reload the tab. YouTube remembers where you are. You're at the 10th minute of whatever lecture video you're looking at, right? But what if you're doing something that will be lost? What if you're writing a blog post for your philosophy class? What if you're, I don't know, buying something on Amazon? Although I guess Amazon remembers what you're trying to buy. Or you're putting in your credit card somewhere that's not Amazon, where it's not gonna, these kind of things. So essentially, yeah, for a lot of us, it probably doesn't happen, but for some subset of the Chrome user base, and Chrome user base a lot, it's 50% of the internet users use Chrome. So if we can save 10,000 people's data in these kind of situations, this is a win for Chrome and Google, essentially. So majority of our 8 months has been working on designs on how to do this. So Chrome is very, very complex. There's about 5 to 10,000 people who've worked on Chrome. So you can imagine our thing kind of goes across the entire Chrome architecture. So we would be asking our liaisons, who are people who work at Google, who work on Chrome, who we interface with weekly. We're like, hey, so how does a tab talk to another tab? And they're like, oh, it's like this. So then we delve into the actual code, and we're like, hey, why is this there? He's like, oh, yeah, I don't know. Let me ask Ken over there who lives in Tokyo. All right, drags us into an email chain there. So it's a very complex and, I guess, real-life experience. And I think compared to Thesis, in a way, first of all, it's collaborative. I know the buddy system is really cool, but this one's like you have to like work with 3 other people. So there are some struggles there. Mostly we've been drama-free, so that's cool. But the other thing is we have weekly meetings. So we have an advisor, a faculty advisor who we meet with, and then we have weekly teleconferences where our liaisons. So we have one guy who is a Mudd alum and another guy who's not a Mudd alum, but he works on this with us. So that's really cool. And then, so along with the process, we have to do a bunch of papers and present to other people who are doing clinic. So it's really cool, because you get to see what other people are working on. Some people are working on, some like engineering clinics are working on actual things they can show you. We work on things we can't really show you, but it's kind of cool to talk about. There's math clinic and physics clinic as well, if you're a math or physics major at Mudd. And I believe CMC kids can participate in those as well. But yeah, if you have any questions about doing math thesis or undergrad math research or Harvey Mudd, CS majors, clinic stuff, you can talk to me after the talk. Thank you.
Hello. I was kind of laughing throughout that presentation that Julian was doing because I actually was in Calc 3 with Julian. And I was in Sam Nelson's Calc 3 class my freshman year, loved math. And the one part of that class that just really went over my head was knot theory. It was very, really, really confusing. So Julian, I commend you for going after that in your thesis. That's incredible. And Sam Nelson, thank you. It's really interesting being on this side of the, okay. Really interesting being on this side of the Athenaeum. I'm used to being on that side. But thank you, Priya, for this incredible opportunity to be here, to speak at the podium, to talk about what a year has come to and is still working on. So thank you for that opportunity and all of the incredible people who've gone before me this evening. So this is a working thesis title, Race and Affirmative Action in a Post-Racial Democracy. So I am an IR major. Bill Asher, who's over here, is my thesis reader. And I had kind of been thinking a lot about what I was going to write about for my thesis for a long time. A year ago, I had the opportunity, or a year and a half ago, I had the opportunity to live in Argentina, Buenos Aires, Argentina, for 6 months. It was incredible. Had the opportunity to do some travel in the Southern Cone. My family is from Mexico. I've had the opportunity to travel there. And this past summer, I lived in Lima, Peru for 3 months. So I've had some opportunity to travel in Latin America. Latin America is my focus for my major, IR. And if there's any one thing I love about Latin America, in fact, it's not one thing, it's many things. The diverse culture, the food, the dress, religions, traditions, and the people, especially the people. And you know, these are things that make Latin America special, and we can attribute those things to many, many people who have come together to create what we now know as Latin America. It's a large region. But the narrative that we're given of Latin America, unfortunately, doesn't really credit all of these groups. The history that we're told, that we read, is of the feats of the Iberians in the New World. But what about the indigenous groups that have been there for thousands and thousands and thousands of years? We know a little bit. We know a little bit about the Incans of Peru, the Aztecs of Mexico. But what do we really know about these people? And what about the millions of Africans imported to Latin America from Spanish and Portuguese colonies in West Africa and Angola? We're not told that narrative. That's not one that we read about in our history books as much. So I really wanted to look into this. And when I was studying abroad, I've always kind of been really interested in identity politics. And so one project I did in my program was I went around and asked people in Argentina, which is a specifically interesting country to be in because Argentina is known for its immigration. And so everyone in Buenos Aires looks like they're from Europe. You feel like you're in Europe, in fact. It was an interesting place to study abroad. And so I remember going around, and what I did was I asked various Argentines, what race are you? And everybody I asked, no matter what they looked like, no matter where they lived or what sort of socioeconomic status they held, they all told me, I don't have race. I'm not a race, I'm Argentine, we're all Argentines. And in fact, I remember my host mom, who was more comfortable with me than a random person on the street, told me, why are you Americans so obsessed with race? Stop talking about race. This isn't a thing in Latin America. In Mexico, same thing, which I've experienced with my family. And so, you know, this idea of kind of like erasing race when it's, especially in Latin America, something that we see, anti-Blackness and anti-indigeneity is so visible. This often kind of erases the existence of these people who live in this part of the world. So what is often called the third root, or la tercera raíz, the narrative of Latin America undermines the significant influence of Afro-Latinos and dilutes the fullness that is Latino culture, life, and society. So just some kind of like ideas of how Latin America is made up. More than 150 million Afro-descendants live in and throughout Latin America, contributing to the political, social, and economic development of every single country in Latin America. Additionally, and maybe contributing to their invisibility, Afro-Latinos are more often the poorest and most marginalized within their respective countries. Particularly in Brazil, which is my country of study, 46% of the population self-identifies as Afro-Brazilian, and this key here is self-identification. Studies say that there are many, many, many more people. And Afro-Brazilians actually make up 65% of the lowest socioeconomic class. 18% of Afro-Brazilians graduate from high school and fewer from university. So I actually started this project off in September with 3 countries. And Bill remembers we went through, talked about which countries I would do, and I'd come to Brazil, Venezuela, and Colombia. And while I was doing my research, and just a couple months ago, kind of decided, you know what, I need to focus on one country because there's so much here. So in the end, I chose Brazil because one, there's just it's practical. There's a lot more research, a lot more sources, a lot to talk about. It also allowed me to explore a part of Latin America that I'm least familiar with. I was able to visit, spoke nothing. So it was really difficult for me to really engage in the culture when I did visit. And I'm currently taking Portuguese at Pitzer, and that's been an amazing experience. So this kind of has all allowed me to become more familiar with the topic that I'm so passionate about, but a part of this continent that I'm least familiar with. So yeah, so what I'm trying to show with my thesis is I was hoping to explore how Brazil has sought to govern and mitigate the racial and ethnic tensions within this multiracial society, and what I hope to add to the existing work that's out there is I'm taking a sociological approach in my IR thesis, using self and group identity theory to determine the ways in which Brazilians' existing federal and university affirmative action policies affect ideas of race in Brazil for both Black and non-Black Brazilians, considering how the policies can be improved to serve their initial objectives, which are fighting racial inequalities, compensating for historical injustices, contributing to the diversity of experiences and perspectives on campus, and raising understanding of what it means to be Black in Brazil. So I don't have a lot of time this evening. What I did in my thesis, or what I'm doing in my thesis, as I'm not quite done yet, is I'm doing a couple case studies. So I'm looking at the University of Brasilia, in the country's capital, Brasilia. I'm looking at the Federal University in Paraná, which is in the south. The Federal Universidade do Rio Grande do Sul, which is a university also in the south. And then also looking at the law of social quotas, which was put in by President de Souza in 2012, or sorry, President de Silva in 2012, which basically is what created affirmative action and made it a federal law in universities as well as in federal positions. So I am doing case studies on these 4 situations, looking at not only the policies themselves, but how they were implemented. So how they were written, and then how they actually have worked out so far. And some of my findings there have been that, for example, in the University of Paraná, which follows very closely the law of social quotas, which is the federal law. The law in Paraná requires that that the university have a program for quota students that go through, and they have to essentially participate in 2 parts. Each student that goes through a quota system in any of the universities has to take the vestibular, which is the test that you take to get into the university. Everybody takes it. To get into any program in the university, no matter what your background, everybody takes the vestibular. But also, if you're going to apply under the quota system, you also, at the University of Paraná, have to write a letter. And the key for this is self-identification, which is why I do a lot of work in my thesis on identity theory. And so self-identification part is key because the quota applicant basically has to write this letter proving that, 1, they themselves identify as Afro-Brazilian, and 2, that they are seen outwardly as being Afro-Brazilian, as being a part of that community, so that they can give to the community in the university. Now, you can imagine that this letter is, 1, a little intimidating, because especially in a country where unlike the United States, where we have a little bit more of a one-drop rule, if you're half of something, that's okay. In Brazil, it's a continuum. And so with race, in Brazil, it's a lot easier to either get away with identifying or not identifying. This is something that I really related to, and one reason why I was really looking into this is because I am also identify with something that you wouldn't necessarily see on the cover. So I really looked into especially how people who are applying for the quota who are fit a little bit more at the margin to identify as pardo, which in Portuguese is brown or mixed, or mulato is another term that they use in Brazil, how those people have fared in terms of the quota. So some of my findings so far, that studies show an increase in actual change in racial self-identity following quota programs for students at the margin, which is consistent with the incentives engendered by the policies themselves. These policies also, something I forgot to mention, is once you enter the university, they actually have programs. They bring speakers to talk about that kind of the idea is to uplift the Black community in Brazil, so that people graduate and are ready to enter into a world, into Brazilian society, proud to be who they are in a society that generally puts them down. And so, along with those policies, we find that the people at the margins are actually leaving, identifying more with that side of them than they did before. However, we do run into problems. Schools are not filling their quota spots. The University of Paraná had this problem, and the Rio Grande do Sul also are not filling their spots because the combination of the test, the University of Brasilia has an interview similar where they're basing off of how Black the applicants are, somewhat of a subjective system in a country, again, like Brazil. And so with a combination of their test scores and with the determinants from the interview and the essays, they're not actually filling all their quota spots. This is a problem. But this kind of leads us to the idea that we're talking about in the United States now, that we need to increase the quality of public and public primary and secondary schools. It's a whole other part of the of the affirmative action process is affirmative action for students coming from public schools. I didn't even touch on that in this presentation, but that's another big one in Brazil, is trying to work on the public school system to get people through the universities. And so, that leads us to thinking about how the quality of public and primary and secondary schools in Brazil, something that is currently being worked on. Similarly, we want to make sure that these quota programs are preparing students to go into Brazilian society proud to be who they are, making sure that these programs are doing that. And so my analysis is, I'm finishing with some suggestions based on the research that I've done so far about how this is implemented in universities and how to make this better. Because it's important for all of Brazilian society, for not just Afro-Brazilians or Afro-Latinos, but for everybody in Latin America and everybody in the world, to make sure that this happens, especially in developing countries. To move forward, it requires everybody to be lifted up. So that's what I have so far. In terms of the process, I am very grateful for Bill always being there and always keeping our meetings very light. And like everybody has said before me, having friends to go through the process. Make sure you start thinking about it this summer if you're an underclassman or if you're a junior. And make sure it's something you're interested in, because I've been working on this for now 8 months. And you want to make sure you won't get tired of it, because this is such an important process. You don't want to find yourself the 3 weeks before, when you're doing all your editing, like really done with your topic. So thank you, Priya. Thank you, guys.
So that's it. Have a good night. Okay. So I wrote a little speech for mine because I was meant to put my year-long novel of a thesis into a 5-minute presentation. So my name is Chris Brackman, and the title of my thesis is Gender Division in Sport Through the Eyes of Female Student Athletes at CMS. I'm a dual anthropology and psychology major, but I completed my thesis through the Scripps Anthropology Department with Scripps Professor So-Young Park and CMC History Professor Diana Selig. Thank you for being in attendance tonight. And they're both my readers. I'm one of 3 CMC anthropology majors, so if you want to talk about it afterwards, I'd love to see more at CMC. Anyways, I'm really excited to share my thesis with you all tonight because I conducted my own research on the Claremont Mudd Scripps community. Anthropology, for those of you who don't know, is the study of humans and their culture. So to conduct this research, I did in-depth interviews with well over 20 student athletes and administrators across the 3 colleges, as well as reflected on my own observations in my past 4 years as an Athena. My original plan for this thesis was to explore the various societal pressures female student athletes face in their dual identities as both a woman and a competitive athlete, and how they cope with, resolve, manage these pressures. While my thesis does do this, in addition to looking at the history of modern sport and where women fit into that, it ended up having more of a focus on gender studies, despite never having taken a gender studies course at CMC. So I thought it was pretty interesting to learn about that through the process, and I think that's what the thesis should be about, and it was for me at least. In my thesis, I argue that although Title IX has done a lot to progress women's sports in terms of creating opportunity and access for girls and women to participate in them, there's very much a clear binary gender division through sports that is manifest through stereotypes that have been shaped by history, through images that are portrayed by the mainstream media, and through the reinforcement of such stereotypes and images in the everyday discourse by college men and women. The 3 stereotypes and pressures I specifically explored, though there are many, as female athletes in the audience will attest to, were 1, the constant comparison of athletic performance and the nature of sports between men and women. So basically male superiority and the notion that men's sports are more fun to watch than women's sports, that men are more athletic than women. 2, the association between female athleticism and masculinity. So the pressure to conform to traditional body image ideals and by wearing makeup and doing other girly things when you're out of uniform, as well as the fear of losing other feminine qualities by fear of bulking up in the weight room. And finally, 3, homophobia and the association between female athleticism and lesbianism, especially in certain sports where there's a tendency for people to think that by playing sports, that makes her a lesbian. So since I only have a few minutes, I wanted to explore and share the second argument that I make in my thesis. It's quite obvious, I think, the existence of a gender division in modern sports culture, yeah? You can see it. You know, watch the TV. How many people watched the championship game of the women's NCAA tournament this weekend? Probably not a lot, but that Gonzaga UNC game, yeah. So because of it, we, female athletes, usually blame men for their masculine gaze on women's sports, such as the overt sexualization in caring more for a woman's looks than her athletic performance, as well as their inability to understand what it's like to be a female athlete and to have to constantly live up to all of these expectations of traditional gender norms while trying to earn respect as an athlete in this male-dominated world. However, what I do in my thesis is call attention to the way female athletes reinforce harmful stereotypes about their own sport and the responsibility that we carry to close the divide by reevaluating the way that we think about it. What I found through my research is that female student athletes reinforce 3 concepts of gender hegemony. And hegemony, I've probably used that word about 50 times, no, more than that in my thesis. So it's basically just social norms that are accepted, like men are better than women, heterosexuality is better than homosexuality. That's essentially what gender hegemony is. Anyways, female student athletes reinforce hegemonic masculinity by taking pride in, quote, being one of the guys and judging the pinnacle of our success on how we rank to men. Have women not yet proven themselves capable athletes worthy of emulation too? And why do we not show more support for each other when we know better than to depend on others? 2, female athletes reinforce hegemonic femininity by excusing doing non-feminine things for being an athlete, like when we say we can roll out of bed, put on sweatpants, no makeup, but it's okay. I'm an athlete. I don't have to look good right now. Does this not again reinforce the notion that sports masculinize women? And furthermore, are there no other ways to embody femininity than in your appearance? Finally, female athletes reinforce heteronormativity in sport through the desire to do feminine things that portray their heterosexual identity. Why can we not be more supportive of homosexuality and think instead, if they think I'm gay, it's okay, because I don't have to be straight as an athlete? These questions hopefully make you stop and think. 1, do I think this way about women's sports? And 2, do I see how I reinforce these stereotypes by doing so? In closing, even in 2017, 45 years after the implementation of Title IX and the beginning of the women's sports movement, there is a pervasive gender division that is manifest through various outlets. While it's true that men carry some of the burden of changing the discourse on women's sports, I have demonstrated a need for women to recognize the responsibility and agency they carry to reevaluate the way we talk about traditional masculinity and femininity, athletic performance, body image, and sexuality. I'm not saying that there will never be a gender division in sports culture, nor in society in general, let's be honest here, but I do challenge the way we think, and I encourage people to partake in a critical self-reflection of language and understand its implications. So I just want to thank, that was it, but I just want to thank also Priya for giving me the stage that I wouldn't have otherwise, and thank you to all of you for coming and listening. Thank you again. That's it.
Hello. Oh no. Hi everyone. Wow, it's really interesting to be on this side of the podium. I kind of like it. I dig it. Hi, for all of those that don't know me, my name is Caitlin Faust, and I am one of the few students who chose to venture into the wild west of CMC that is the literature major. Also, right from the get-go, I wanted to let you all in on one of my biggest secrets. I've never taken economics. I'm hoping I can hold out long enough so they can let me graduate. Anyway, I have thoroughly enjoyed my experience in literature classes and with literature faculty, so I'm honored and pleased to have the opportunity to talk to you about the capstone of my 4 years here. Just to second what everyone has been saying, thank you so much for this opportunity. I think it's so great to be able to talk about something that we've spent so much time on for the past year. Anyway, the topic of my thesis doesn't just relate to why I decided to become a literature major, but also to my philosophy and the value and importance of reading and writing, which has developed over the course of my degree. When I think about why I love literature, I'm immediately reminded of its ability to teach. As students, we of course spend lots of hours reading, extracting knowledge, and understanding from what we read. But what I find fascinating is how different people choose to enjoy what they read, each in their own unique way. We evaluate what we read, discern how we feel about certain topics or themes, and may often consider how they relate or don't to ourselves. And this process isn't specific to literature classes either, but is rather simply a characteristic of good writing and in turn analytical thinking. Find a stance, reason it, then articulate it. My best writing is usually about something I care about, something I believe. It is in this way that I see reading and writing as inherently self-evaluative, that in looking outward, we are forced to reflect something inward, which I believe to be a wonderful method of self-growth. When considering what I would write for my year-long thesis, I wasn't quite sure where to start. I had just returned from my semester abroad in Dublin, where I had experienced that cliché perspectival shift that they preach about in study abroad brochures. When I returned, though, I had no idea what I would write about. Of course, I planned to steer as far away from the scary creative route as I could, and after a few weeks of discussion with my reader, I settled on a close reading of the poetry of Seamus Heaney, one of my favorite Irish poets. After about 2 months of work that consisted mainly of avoidance and hatred, I voiced to my reader, Leland Dilladurantai, that I didn't want to do this anymore. The prospect of writing yet another analytical research paper, but one that was bigger, longer, and more important, not to mention what would be the culmination of some of the most formative years of my life, just didn't feel right. It was just the two of us sitting in his office, Leland's big white dog Bear lying on the floor next to his desk. Okay, he said after I had voiced my rebellion, well, I suppose the next question we need to ask is what exactly you want to do. I'd expressed to him my thoughts about reading and what I saw to be its self-evaluative power. I realized that if I was really to listen to what I was saying, it was sounding like I wanted to write a thesis about myself. Right then and there, the fear set in. Although I had spent the last summer teaching personal essay writing to high school students, I suddenly felt a similar fear arise in me that I had observed in them. The words, "but my life just isn't interesting enough," quickly came to mind, but a phrase that I had tried to talk my students out of countless times, pulling vignettes by famous authors, writing about aspects of ordinary life, such as diving off a diving board at a birthday party, the color blue, or an old pair of sneakers. Most often they liked them, and I told them, see, it's all in the writing. But I'm no famous writer. I wondered if my new thesis endeavor made me some sort of self-indulgent narcissist, and I didn't even know where to start. So, like many good lit majors, I started reading. I read other people's work to find my own. Leland suggested several memoirs like Karl Knausgaard's My Struggle and Andre Agassi's Open. I read Rousseau and Nabokov, some Joyce and Joan Didion. I loved the different ways in which these authors went about their styles. Some were linear, some were roundabout and peppered with memories and flashbacks. Some were confession-like, others were more conservative in what they chose to show. I realized that the immeasurable differences in individuals was mimicked in their styles and selective choices in the personal writing genre. Like many students at CMC, I am also a varsity athlete. I play soccer and have done so now for 16 years. It is what brought me to CMC, what has been one of my most consistent companions since the age of 6. As all college sports do, though, near the end of the semester, my senior season came to a close.
Upon the cessation of my career in the sport that I had repeatedly told my family and friends that I loved, rather than the expected feeling of horrible depression and loss, I instead felt a kind of clarity. Suddenly, 16 years of beliefs, of ways of thinking, and mindsets seemed to vanish. I expressed to Leland my confusion upon experiencing these feelings and how I felt like an entire space in my brain had been relieved from 16 years of accumulated weight. I think you need to write about that, he told me. So I began this project, beginning with my very first soccer game and ending with my last. Through writing, I have discovered that although soccer was who I was for a long time, it is more importantly the setting in which I formulated entrenched and formidable ways of thinking about myself, ones that only until I was able to practice methods of dethroning, I could keep from causing lots of pain. In my thesis, I grapple with the challenge of confronting my own previously held belief and how they've changed through childhood and adolescence and into adulthood. To directly quote my thesis, when authors write about childhood, it seems as though we grant them a level of forgiveness for their inconsistencies. We allow their firm convictions to be presented to us in separate, opposing forms. Perhaps we subconsciously trust the validity of the author's uncertainty because we too have experienced this nullification of strong beliefs from youth to adulthood. Perhaps this is because uncertainty is an inherent problem of growth. Throughout this process, I've experienced everything from laughing at the things I thought made me cool when I was 12, to frustrated crying, wish I hadn't been so hard on myself in an environment that was supposed to be just for fun. And just a quick side tangent to that, I was texting my mom before this and she said, are you gonna go up and how are you feeling? And I was like, well, I'm a little nervous, shocked in front of everybody. And she was like, make it fun. I would love to stand before you and say my uncertain sense of self has clarified itself in this capstone project, but of course, that wouldn't be honest. Instead, through writing, I have come to understand my own state of flux, my sense of self, and one's ability, or rather inevitability, for change. Thank you.
Just a very quick note, I really want to thank all the seniors who stepped up, they volunteered, I strong-armed some of them, but just in a suggestive way. And they just did a brilliant job. Thank you so much. I hope that this is the first of many senior showcases. You guys were outstanding. Thank you again. Thank you everyone for coming.